Case number 1, Peter Madsen, the inventor and the journalist. On the evening of August 10th, 2017, Kim Wall was supposed to be celebrating. She and her boyfriend, Old Stab, had planned a farewell party in Refshaloen, a send-off before the two of them relocated to Beijing to begin a new chapter. Somewhere during that evening, her phone buzzed. A message from Peter Madsen. He was taking his submarine out and wondered if she wanted to come along for an interview. She had been working on a story about his space ambitions, developing a pitch for Wired magazine. The trip would take 2 hours. She left the party early, walked down to the harbor, and boarded the UC-3 Nautilus at approximately 7 p.m. It was the last time anyone who loved her would see her alive. Peter Langkjær Madsen was born on January 12, 1971, and raised in Hung, Denmark. He had no formal engineering credentials. What he had instead was a particular kind of obsession, a childhood fascination with rockets and submarines that he pursued with crowd-funded resources, self-taught skills, and an extraordinary appetite for public attention. He fired his first model rocket at the age of 15, and the projects grew from there. In 2008, he co-founded Copenhagen Suborbitals, an amateur human spaceflight program, alongside architect Christian von Bengtsen, and launched the UC-3 Nautilus, a 17-meter vessel described at the time as the largest privately built submarine in the world. He departed the program in 2014 and founded Rocket Madsen Space Lab, continuing to attract journalists, volunteers, and the kind of admiring media coverage that builds a public identity. He was married, his wife worked in the film industry, and had helped in his workshop. And he later acknowledged to investigators that he maintained what he called an open relationship and regularly brought other women onto the submarine. A psychiatric evaluation conducted during his trial would find that he possessed no empathy and no feelings of guilt. The court's formal characterization was that he had psychopathic tendencies. Kim Isabel Frederica Wall was born on March the 23rd, 1987 in Trelleborg, Sweden. She had studied international relations at the London School of Economics and earned dual graduate degrees in journalism and international affairs from Columbia University in New York. Her work appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Atlantic, Harper's Magazine, Time, and Vice. She focused on underreported stories, identity, subcultures, social justice, the margins of modern life, and had reported from Sri Lanka, Haiti, Cuba, Uganda, and the Marshall Islands. In 2016, she received the Hansel Meath Prize for Best Digital Reporting for her coverage of climate change and nuclear weapons testing in the Marshall Islands. She had been nominated for the Prix Europa Outstanding Achievement Award. She was 30 years old. She was moving to Beijing in days. The submarine departed that evening with only 2 people aboard. Within hours, it had not returned as expected. Stab waited. Then he reported her missing at approximately 1:43 in the morning. By early morning on August 11th, the UC-3 Nautilus was located south of Copenhagen, near the Drogden Lighthouse, sinking. Madsen was pulled from the water alive. Kim Wall was not aboard. He told investigators he had dropped her off at a Copenhagen island several hours into the trip. Then that story changed. She had died, he said, when a heavy hatch cover, weighing approximately 70 kilograms, fell and struck her head during the voyage. Then that story changed again. By trial, he was claiming she had died from toxic fumes inside the vessel while he was on deck. Each version collapsed under scrutiny. The hatch story dissolved when Wall's head was recovered without skull fractures. The toxic fume account could not be reconciled with the physical evidence that had accumulated by then. Wall's dismembered torso was found floating in Copenhagen Bay on August 21st, stabbed 15 times, including in the genital area. The submarine was raised from the seabed on August 13th and examined. Investigators found that Madsen had brought tools onto the vessel that he did not normally take sailing. In October, Wall's head, legs, and clothing were discovered in weighted plastic bags on the Baltic seabed. Investigators found videos of women being tortured and killed on his personal computer, not produced by him, but collected and stored. Semen was found in his underwear. 2 other women testified during trial that Madsen had previously invited them separately onto the Nautilus, one in May 2017, one in June, and that they had declined or left without incident. Prosecution argued the murder had been premeditated and sexually motivated. Prosecutor Jacob Buch-Jepsen described the case as very unusual and extremely disturbing. Madsen's 12-day trial opened at Copenhagen City Court on March 8, 2018. He testified and denied killing Wall. Judge Annette Burko was not persuaded. On April 25, 2018, Madsen was convicted of premeditated murder, aggravated sexual assault, and indecent handling of a corpse. The judge stated that his accidental death explanations were not credible and that he had dismembered Wall's body to conceal evidence. She added that the court considered his account not consistent with the following decision to dismember the body. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, a sentence that in Denmark equates to a minimum of approximately 16 years, extendable if necessary. He appealed. The Eastern High Court upheld the life sentence in September 2018. In December 2019, while imprisoned, Madsen married Jenny Kirpin, a former Russian opposition activist and illustrator living in exile in Finland. In 2020, a Danish television documentary titled The Secret Recordings with Peter Madsen aired more than 20 hours of conversations recorded with Madsen in his cell. In it, he confirmed for the first time what investigators had concluded 3 years earlier. Asked directly whether he had killed Kim Wall, he answered yes. "It's my fault she died," he said. "I committed the crime. There is only one who is guilty, and that is me." He remains imprisoned at Ennermark Prison, currently 55 years old. Kim Wall's parents compiled a book about her life and work. A memorial fund established in her name supports female journalists covering significant and underreported stories, the exact kind of work she had built her career doing. She had been 30 years old, preparing to begin a new chapter. She had left her own farewell party to conduct an interview aboard a submarine built by a man the world had decided was worth paying attention to. No cause of death was ever conclusively established. What is established is everything else. Case number 2, Dagmar Overby, the baby farmer. In the early decades of the 20th century, an unmarried woman in Denmark who became pregnant faced a set of choices that were, in most cases, impossible. Social stigma was severe and immediate. Employment as a domestic servant, the occupation of many young women in Copenhagen, was contingent on respectability. An illegitimate child could end a career, destroy a family's standing, and leave both mother and infant without any means of support. The sum a domestic servant might earn in a year was not enough to maintain a household. And so some women, facing this impossible arithmetic, made what they believed was the best available decision. They paid someone to take the child and find it a home. They handed over a baby they would likely never see again, and they tried to believe they had given it a chance at a life better than the one they could provide. Dagmar Johanna Amalie Overby was born on April 23, 1887 in Skanderborg, near Aarhus, the daughter of poor farmers. She moved to Copenhagen around 1915 and established herself in the Nørrebro district as a professional child caretaker, what was then commonly called a baby farmer. She offered to take infants from mothers who could not keep them and arrange for them to be placed with loving families. The fee she charged was approximately 200 kroner per child, roughly equivalent to a year's wages for a domestic servant, an amount these women paid out of desperation and hope. She appeared legitimate. She appeared helpful. She appeared to every mother who came to her door between 1913 and 1920 to be a solution to an otherwise unsolvable problem. She killed at least 9 of those children, and likely many more, including one of her own. She strangled them, drowned them, and burned them to death in her masonry heater. Their ashes went into the stove or were scattered. Their bodies were buried in the loft or in the ground beneath her home. She had 3 children of her own, Irina Marie, Poul, and Axel, and continued her murders across 7 years without detection. The victims were newborns and very young infants, all born outside marriage, all handed over by mothers who believed they were securing better lives for children they could not openly keep. After Overby's arrest, over 180 children were reported as potentially missing from her care. The count on which she was convicted, 9, almost certainly represents a fraction of the actual total. Some historians believe the true number may have exceeded 25. She confessed to approximately 16 murders during police interrogation because she burned the bodies and because the mothers who had entrusted their children to her had every practical reason to remain silent about having done so. The precise total will never be established. The case sits in Danish criminal history, carrying an uncertainty that is itself part of its horror. Her methods were varied and efficient: strangulation for some, drowning for others, the masonry heater for those she burned. The choice of method appears to have varied with circumstance. The remains were cremated, buried, or concealed in the loft of her residence in Nørrebro. The disappearances went unreported for years, not because no one noticed, but because the social structure that had created her market also ensured that the people most likely to notice were the least able to raise questions. The mothers who had paid her had implicated themselves by doing so. They could not ask what had happened to their children without revealing that they had had them. Investigation began after an inquiry into a specific missing child came to the attention of authorities. The precise trigger is not fully documented in accessible sources. During police interrogation, Overby admitted to approximately 16 murders, though forensic reconstruction was severely hampered by the deliberate destruction of most physical evidence. The trial opened in early 1921 and became one of the most widely covered criminal proceedings in Danish history to that point. The court convicted her of 9 murders, the number for which sufficient evidence could be assembled. On March 3rd, 1921, she was sentenced to death, the first woman to receive a capital sentence in Denmark since 1861. King Christian X commuted the sentence on May 25th, 1921, stating publicly that in an enlightened Denmark, the state did not execute its women. She was transferred to life imprisonment at Vestre Fængsel in Copenhagen. She died there on May 6, 1929, aged 42, having served 8 years. The most significant consequence of Dagmar Overby's crimes was not the sentence, but the legislation that followed. In 1923, the Danish government passed the Foster Children Act, the country's first systematic legal framework for protecting children born outside marriage. The law established publicly funded homes for illegitimate children and placed responsibility for their welfare with the state, rather than leaving them entirely to the informal private market that Overby had operated within and exploited. The case is preserved in the Police History Museum in Nørrebro, Copenhagen. It inspired a fictional novel, Engelmagersken, The Angel Maker. It is remembered in Denmark over a century later, not only because of its horror, but because of what it forced the country to recognize: that the children of women the world had decided not to help had a claim on protection that the law had not yet acknowledged. Overby's crimes made that claim impossible to ignore any longer. Case number 3. Thomas Quick/Sturbergwall. The confession. There is a question at the center of this case that has never been fully answered, and perhaps never will be. The question is not whether Sture Bergwall was a serial killer. The courts decided he could not be proven to be one, that the evidence, stripped of his own confessions, was insufficient to sustain any of the 8 murder convictions that had been built on top of those confessions. The question that remains is whether the entire Swedish justice system spent nearly a decade convicting a man for crimes he did not commit, or whether it convicted a man who had committed those crimes but was eventually freed because the system had assembled no evidence beyond his word. Both possibilities are disturbing. The case is disturbing, regardless of which is correct. Sture Ragnar Bergwall was born on April 26, 1950, in Korsnäs, Falun, Sweden. He grew up with 6 siblings and had a documented history of sex offenses against minors before his adult criminal record accumulated further. He had a prior conviction for armed bank robbery. In 1991, following that conviction, he was committed to Säter Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility in central Sweden, where he would remain for more than 2 decades. He was already there, already medicated heavily on benzodiazepines, already enrolled in a therapeutic program led by psychologist Margit Norell, when in 1993, he adopted a new name. He called himself Thomas Quick, and Thomas Quick began to confess. One confession became several, several became dozens. By the time the process had run its course, Bergwall had confessed to more than 30 murders across Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland. Crimes alleged to span from 1964 to 1993. He described homicides in graphic detail. He described sexual violence. In some accounts, he described cannibalism. Investigators listened carefully and followed up. Courts convicted him of 8 murders across 6 separate trials, held between 1994 and 2001. The confessions were detailed and disturbing, and in nearly every case, they were the primary evidence, sometimes the only evidence, connecting Bergwall to the crimes. In 2 of the 8 cases, no body was ever found. No forensic evidence linked Bergwall to any of the murders with certainty. When he provided incorrect details about victims' appearances or the sequence of events, errors that might, in another context, have prompted investigators to question whether he had actually been present. His therapists interpreted those errors as evidence of repressed trauma, not fabrication. Every mistake was absorbed into the framework of belief. Every discrepancy confirmed what everyone already thought they knew. A review conducted by Sweden's Chancellor of Justice in 2006 examined the convictions and found no problems. 2 years later, everything that review had approved began to fall apart. Journalist Hannes Rostam investigated the case and produced a television documentary. Bergwall recanted. He told the program, and subsequently told investigators, prosecutors, and courts, that he had fabricated the identity of Thomas Quick entirely. He said he had confessed to murders he had not committed because he craved attention, because he was heavily medicated and psychologically vulnerable in ways the therapeutic environment had intensified rather than addressed, and because the detail that is perhaps most extraordinary, he had been afraid of being released. His bank robbery sentence had been expiring. Discharge from Säter would have meant returning to a world he did not want to face. The confessions had given him a reason to remain. "If I hadn't accepted therapy and benzodiazepines," he said in one later account, "no Thomas Quick would have been created." Retrials were ordered in each of the 8 cases. Prosecutors reviewed what evidence existed independent of the confessions. The conclusion was the same across every case. Without the confessions, there was nothing. The final case, involving the 1976 disappearance of a 15-year-old boy from northern Sweden, was dropped in July 2013. All 8 murder convictions had been quashed. Bergwall was released from Säter Hospital in 2014, aged 63, having spent 23 years there. Dan Josephson, the journalist who published a book on the case titled "The Man Who Stopped Lying," called it the judicial scandal of a century. The Swedish government established a commission to examine what had failed. The commission identified systemic problems: the uncritical acceptance of confession evidence, the influence of the therapeutic environment, the collapse of normal evidentiary standards, but stopped short of assigning individual responsibility to any of the investigators, psychologists, prosecutors, or judges who had built and sustained 8 murder convictions on foundations that, as it turned out, were not there. Sture Bergwall is currently 76 years old and free. He published a book with his brother in 2011 while still at Säter, titled "Thomas Quick is Dead." He gives occasional interviews. He has acknowledged his prior sex offenses. He has consistently denied committing murder. Those 8 cases, closed for lack of evidence, remain officially unresolved. The people who disappeared in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland across those decades still have no confirmed answers about what happened to them. Whether Bergwall ever had those answers, and whether he shared them or fabricated them, is the question that defines this case, and that the collapse of the legal proceedings left permanently open. Case number 4, John Ausonius, the Laser Man. People walking through Stockholm and Uppsala in the autumn of 1991 began noticing something that, for a brief moment, they could not entirely explain. A small point of red light appearing sometimes on their clothing, sometimes on the ground just ahead of them. Most would not understand what it meant until they heard the shot. Some would not understand until they woke in a hospital. One would not wake at all. John Ausonius had equipped his rifle with a laser sight, and the red dot became the only warning his victims received before the violence. A brief mark of selection, followed by a bullet, followed by a city trying to comprehend what was happening to it. John Wolfgang Alexander Ausonius was born Wolfgang Alexander Zaug on July 12, 1953, in Lidingö, Sweden. His birth name is no longer the one he is known by, and the change itself carries a kind of symbolism, a reinvention built around an ideology rather than an identity. He had prior robbery convictions and had served time in Swedish prisons, where he encountered and developed connections to far-right criminal networks. Among his acquaintances during this period was Miro Barisic, a Croatian nationalist assassin and member of the Croatian National Resistance, who had been imprisoned for the murder of the Yugoslav ambassador to Sweden. By the time Ausonius walked out of prison and onto the streets of Stockholm, he had constructed a worldview in which immigrants represented a threat that Swedish society was failing to resist. He wanted to frighten immigrants out of the country. He had decided that targeted violence could accomplish what political discourse had not. He did not choose his victims because of anything they had done. He chose them because of how they appeared. Between August 3rd, 1991, and January 23rd, 1992, Ausonius conducted 11 shootings across Stockholm and Uppsala. His weapon was initially a sawed-off rifle fitted with the laser sight that would give him his name, later supplemented by a revolver with a homemade silencer, a modification that damaged the weapon's performance and contributed to the survival of several intended victims. His first target was a 27-year-old Eritrean student, shot and wounded in August 1991. On October 21st, he shot 25-year-old Shahram Khosravi, a student of Iranian origin, outside Stockholm University, striking him in the face. Khosravi survived. Jimmy Ranjbar did not. Ranjbar was 34 years old, Iranian, shot in the head and killed. The one confirmed fatality among Ausonius' Swedish victims. His other targets came from Iran, Brazil, Greece, Syria, and Zimbabwe. What they shared was dark hair, dark skin, or an appearance that Ausonius categorized as non-Swedish. That categorization was sufficient in his calculation to make them appropriate targets. Communities across Stockholm and Uppsala began altering their routines in response. People avoided certain streets, certain hours. The Swedish police manhunt that followed was described by authorities as comparable in scale to the investigation into the 1986 assassination of Prime Minister Olof Palme, the most significant unsolved crime in modern Swedish history at the time. In February 1992, while already a wanted man across Sweden, Ausonius was in Frankfurt, Germany. He had been in that city while continuing to evade Swedish investigators. On February 23rd, he shot and killed Blanka Zmigrod near her workplace. She was 68 years old. She had been born in Poland. She had survived multiple Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz. She had built a life in post-war Germany and was working as a coat check attendant at a move-and-pick restaurant when Ausonius, apparently believing she had taken an electronic notebook from his coat, shot her dead in daylight on a Frankfurt street. The weapon used in Frankfurt matched ballistic evidence that German investigators would not connect to Ausonius for more than 2 decades. He was arrested in June 1992. Not because of the shooting investigation, but in the course of committing another bank robbery, the crime that had defined his record before the shootings began. His trial in Sweden concluded in January 1994 with a sentence of life imprisonment for the murder of Jimmy Ranjbar, 10 counts of attempted murder, and multiple robbery convictions. He was sent to Österåker prison. German prosecutors reopened the Zmigrod case in 2014 as part of a nationwide review of suspected far-right killings. Ausonius was extradited to Germany in late 2016 and tried in Frankfurt. He denied killing Zmigrod. The court convicted him in February 2018 and sentenced him to a second term of life imprisonment to be served concurrently in Sweden. He is currently 72 years old, imprisoned at Österåker prison. In 2016, he was briefly granted unsupervised leave from custody, a decision that was rescinded following the German conviction. He has since been caught twice attempting to smuggle drugs during supervised leave. At his own trial in 2012, Anders Behring Breivik named Ausonius as someone who had shared his goals. Ausonius' attacks are believed by researchers to have also influenced the Swedish serial shooter Peter Mangs, and to have served as a reference point for the German neo-Nazi group, the National Socialist Underground. The violence did not end when Ausonius was arrested in 1992. It found students. The red dot on Stockholm streets in 1991 left a pattern that others would attempt to replicate in Malmö, in Oslo, in Frankfurt. And Blanka Zmigrod, who had survived Auschwitz and built a life in the country whose ideology had tried to destroy her, was killed by a man who wished that ideology had succeeded. Case number 5, Anders Behring Breivik. July 22nd. On the island of Utoya, on the afternoon of July 22nd, 2011, the young people gathered at the Workers' Youth League summer camp heard about the bombing in Oslo. Word had reached the island within the hour. 8 people were dead in the government quarter. The country was in shock. The camp's participants were frightened, uncertain, gathering in groups, trying to understand what had happened and what might follow. When a uniformed police officer stepped off a boat and walked toward them not long after, many of them moved in his direction. He appeared to be there to help. He appeared to be part of the response to what had happened in Oslo. Several hundred of those young people, most of them teenagers, had just made the most consequential mistake of their lives. The officer was Anders Behring Breivik. The uniform was a disguise. Anders Behring Breivik was born on February 13th, 1979, in Oslo. He had joined the Anti-Immigration Progress Party as a young man, chaired its youth branch, and left the organization in 2006. A business he founded subsequently went bankrupt. He reported no income in 2009. He financed the attacks with approximately 130,000 euros in credit card debt accumulated over years of preparation. He spent 6 days in Prague in late 2010, specifically to source weapons, noting in his own documentation that the city was useful for such purposes. He joined a gun club in 2005. He had been arrested at 16 for graffiti vandalism, and on the morning of July 22, 2011, he distributed a 1,500-page manifesto titled 2083, a European Declaration of Independence, a document articulating his belief that Norway, Europe, and Western civilization were being destroyed by immigration and Islam, and what he termed cultural Marxism, and that violence on a sufficient scale was the only adequate response. He had been planning what followed for years. At 3:25 in the afternoon, an ANFO fertilizer car bomb detonated in Regjeringskvartalet, the government quarter of Oslo. The blast killed 8 people, most of them civil servants in the surrounding buildings, and destroyed significant sections of the district. Emergency services responded immediately. The country's attention focused on the capital. Breivik had already left for the ferry to Utoya. He arrived at the island at 5:21 p.m., presented himself as a police officer conducting a security briefing following the Oslo attack, and began shooting. He was armed with a Ruger Mini 14 rifle and a Glock 34 pistol. For 73 minutes, he moved through the island, firing at people who ran, who hid behind rocks, who tried to swim across the approximately 600-meter stretch of water to the mainland. Some made it, many did not. Police arrived approximately 1 hour and 22 minutes after the shooting began, delayed by logistical failures that subsequent investigations documented in detail. Breivik surrendered without resistance when they reached him. By that point, 69 people had been killed on Utoya. Combined with the 8 killed in Oslo, the total was 77 dead. More than 320 more were physically injured, and many hundreds beyond them were psychologically traumatized. The youngest victims were teenagers who had barely entered secondary school. It remains the deadliest act of right-wing terrorism in modern European history, and the worst atrocity in Norway since the German occupation of the Second World War. Breivik was charged with terrorism and aggravated premeditated murder. His 10-week trial opened at Oslo District Court on April 16, 2012. He admitted every act while denying criminal guilt, maintaining that what he had done was a necessary response to what he characterized as the destruction of Norway. He refused to plead guilty. He told the court he did not recognize its legitimacy. The central legal question at trial was not what had happened, but whether Breivik was legally sane. 2 psychiatric teams reached opposite conclusions. The prosecution argued he was a paranoid schizophrenic who should be confined to a psychiatric facility rather than a prison. The defense, and conspicuously, Breivik himself, argued for a finding of sanity. He wanted a prison sentence and the political recognition of rational agency that came with it. He said he would not appeal if found insane, because an insanity verdict would mean the court had sided with the multicultural majority by denying him the status of a reasoned actor. On August 24, 2012, Judge Wenche Elizabeth Arntzen delivered the verdict Breivik had fought for. The court found him sane, noting narcissistic personality characteristics, but no psychosis. and convicted him on all counts of terrorism and aggravated premeditated murder. He was sentenced to 21 years of preventive detention, the maximum civilian penalty under Norwegian law, with a minimum of 10 years before eligibility for review. That sentence is extendable indefinitely, as long as each review concludes he remains a danger to society. He is 47 years old, imprisoned at Ringerike prison, taking university courses in mathematics and business, and legally renamed Viotolf Hansen. Every review conducted since his conviction has found that he remains dangerous. In 2016, he sued the Norwegian government for human rights violations related to isolation and conditions of confinement. A district court partially ruled in his favor. A higher court overturned that ruling. The Supreme Court declined to hear the case. He continues filing motions. Norway observes July 22nd each year. Survivors of Utøya have built political organizations, published memoirs, and returned to the island, which now has a permanent memorial visible from the mainland. Several of those who survived the shooting went on to lead the youth movement Breivik had targeted. The island is still used for a summer camp. The people who were there in 2011 and the families of the people who were not are still carrying what happened on it. Case number 6. Arnfinn Neset, the director. A nursing home is built around a particular kind of trust. The people who enter them cannot fully care for themselves. They arrive at a point in their lives where they depend on others for medication, for meals, for the ordinary assistance that independence once made invisible. That dependency is total, and it is largely invisible to the outside world. The residents are elderly. They are often at a distance from family. They die at rates that do not surprise anyone, because death among the elderly and unwell is not unexpected and not, in most circumstances, an occasion for suspicion. A geriatric institution is, by its nature, a place where killing could be conducted with less likelihood of detection than almost anywhere else in a modern society. Arnfinn Neset appears to have understood this clearly and to have used it systematically. Arnfinn Neset was born on October 25, 1936, in Trøndelag, Norway, the illegitimate son of a woman who raised him alone. He trained as a registered nurse and built a career in Norwegian healthcare. In 1977, he was hired as the head nurse and manager of Orkdal Valley Nursing Home, a geriatric institution in Orkdal, Sør-Trøndelag, a position that gave him supervisory authority over the institution, its staff, its patients, and its supply procurement. He was described by colleagues and acquaintances as professional, soft-spoken, and competent. He wore glasses and spoke quietly. Through the nursing home's official procurement channels, he had obtained a drug called Curacit, a brand name for tubocurarine, a muscle relaxant that, administered in sufficient quantity, causes respiratory paralysis and death, and that degrades rapidly in body tissue after death, making forensic detection increasingly difficult as time passes. He later claimed, when first questioned by investigators, that he had purchased it to kill a pack of wild dogs that had gathered near the facility. Between 1977 and 1980, 22 patients at Orkdal died under Neset's direct care. They ranged in age from 67 to 95. Their bodies were cremated after death, which was standard practice at the time, and which destroyed the physical evidence that would have been needed to establish a definitive forensic link between any individual death and a specific cause. Investigators calculated that up to 60 deaths at the facility carried suspicious characteristics. Some estimates of Neset's possible total victim count reached as high as 138, though the prosecution at trial focused on the 22 cases for which the circumstantial evidence was strongest. In early 1981, local journalists began writing about the nursing home's unusually high mortality rate. Police opened an investigation that summer and autumn. During initial questioning, Nesset's explanation of the Kurisit purchase, the wild dogs, lasted briefly. He then confessed to killing 27 patients. At one point during interrogation, according to investigators present, he stated that he had killed so many patients, he was no longer able to remember all of them. He subsequently retracted every admission and entered not guilty pleas before trial. The trial lasted 5 months at Frostading District Court and required the testimony of 123 witnesses. There was virtually no surviving physical forensic evidence. The bodies had been cremated and the drug had degraded. The prosecution reconstructed its case from medical records, Kurisit purchase documentation, witness accounts, and the weight of Nesset's own confessions, which he had withdrawn before proceedings began. He was not present in the courtroom when the verdict was delivered. On March the 18th, 1983, the court convicted him of 22 murders. The maximum sentence available under Norwegian law at the time was 21 years imprisonment, which he received, plus a further 10 years of preventive detention. The chief prosecutor described Nesset in court as a man driven by a desire for complete control over the life and death of his patients, the only characterization of motive that the evidence could sustain. He served approximately 12 years before being released on parole in the mid-1990s, living subsequently under a new name in an undisclosed location in Norway, subject to a period of supervised release. He died on December 2nd, 2025, aged 89, peacefully in a nursing home, a detail confirmed by his attorney, Per Arne Skog, to the Norwegian publication VG. In 2025, the year of his death, detective and author Simen Sætre published a book titled The Unlikely Serial Killer. Arnfinn Nesset and his 31 confessions, presenting evidence that the case may represent Norway's most serious wrongful conviction. Sætre argued that the convictions rested on confessions Nesset had retracted, on circumstantial evidence from which the physical foundation, the patient's bodies, had been permanently removed by cremation, and on an investigation conducted in the absence of independent corroboration for any of the 22 counts. Nesset, Sætre noted, had lacked the health and resources to pursue a reopening of the proceedings himself. The book did not resolve the case. It reopened the question of whether it had ever been resolved to begin with. Nesset was convicted of 22 murders. He served 12 years. He died at 89. Whether those facts represent justice or its opposite depends on a question that cannot now be answered with certainty. Case number 7. Peter Mangs, Laserman II. There is a phrase that appeared in Swedish news coverage of what was happening in Malmö between 2003 and 2010, a period of terror. It was the phrase used by residents of the city's immigrant communities to describe what it felt like to live in Malmö during those years, when an unidentified gunman was selecting targets based on their appearance and firing at them in their homes, in their cars, and in the streets. People put tape over their letterboxes at night to prevent a gunman from watching through them. They spoke to journalists about changed routes, avoided windows, shortened the hours they spent outside after dark. The fear was not abstract. It had a specific geography. Malmö, a coastal city in southern Sweden, of approximately 300,000 people, roughly 40% of whom were first or second generation immigrants, and a specific and deliberate logic. Someone had decided this population was a target. For 7 years, nobody knew who. Peter Mangs was born in 1972 and raised in Sweden. Before the killings, his background was in some respects unremarkable. He had worked in the restaurant industry, had no significant criminal record, and had lived in Malmö for years without drawing particular attention. Investigators who examined his history after his arrest found that he had consulted psychiatric services as early as 2003, at the beginning of the killing period, disclosing at that consultation that he was easily insulted and had what he described as an interest in death. He had studied the crimes of John Ausonius, the Stockholm racist sniper of 1991 and 1992, and appears to have modeled elements of his own campaign on what Ausonius had done. He was later explicitly compared to Ausonius in media coverage and by investigators, and has been described as Laser Man II, a title that acknowledges the direct ideological and tactical lineage between the two cases. His stated goal was to ignite a race war by creating fear in Malmö's immigrant communities. He identified categories of targets: Muslims, Roma, people of African descent in Sweden, and individuals he considered race traitors. Swedes who associated with or were in relationships with non-white people. Between June 2003 and October 2010, Mangs carried out at least 15 shootings in Malmö using a Glock 19 pistol. His first confirmed murders occurred in June and July of 2003, when he killed 65-year-old Kuros Efashian and 23-year-old Firas Al-Sharia, both selected because their names indicated non-white heritage. He continued intermittently across the following years, firing shots at homes, cars, and businesses, seriously injuring a number of people and narrowly failing to kill several more. In the autumn of 2009, he began operating with greater frequency. In fall 2009, he fired 11 shots at a car in the Rosengård area of Malmö. A 20-year-old Swedish woman named Therese West Persson was sitting in the car with a man of immigrant origin, the actual target. She died. She had not been his intended victim. He later told a Swedish newspaper from prison, "It was a hunt. When the right opportunity presented itself, one that filled all the right criteria, then the idea was to do it." Mangs was arrested in November 2010, following a combination of a witness tip and forensic ballistic analysis that linked his weapon to multiple crime scenes across the 7-year period. His trial at Malmö District Court attracted extensive public and media attention. In July 2012, the court found him guilty of 2 murders and 4 counts of attempted murder. A psychiatric evaluation submitted before sentencing concluded that Mangs had not been suffering from serious mental illness at the time of the crimes, and that no special treatment was warranted in sentencing. On November 23, 2012, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. The court characterized his crimes as displaying extreme recklessness and a complete lack of empathy for other people. He appealed. The Malmö Appeals Court denied his appeal in April 2013, adding 3 further convictions for attempted murder to his record in the process. The Supreme Court declined to hear the case. He is currently in his early 50s and remains imprisoned. In a 2013 interview conducted at Kumla Prison, one of Sweden's highest security facilities, Mangs confirmed to the newspaper Sydsvenskan that he had been responsible for the killing of Therese West Persson, the murder he had denied throughout trial. He offered no remorse. He offered instead the same categorical logic he had applied in 2003 when he killed his first victims, that the people he fired at were appropriate targets by virtue of what they were or who they associated with. The victims of the Malmö shootings, the dead, the wounded, the communities that spent 7 years watching their windows, were collateral to a goal that Mangs never came close to achieving, and that no act of violence of this kind has ever achieved. The city's immigrant population did not leave. They watched and waited and continued their lives under a weight of fear that lasted 7 years. Case number 8, Ino Nykop Koski, the nurse. There is a version of trust that is not chosen but imposed by circumstance. It is the trust you extend when you are in a hospital bed and someone approaches with medication and you accept it. Not because you have evaluated the situation and found it safe, but because you are ill and they are trained and you have no alternative. You are dependent. The arrangement is fundamental. And it is, for the same reason, among the most exploitable forms of human vulnerability that exists in a modern society. The patient cannot verify what is in the syringe. The patient often cannot clearly describe their symptoms or their recent treatment. The patient is frequently elderly, isolated, and in a context where death is expected and not, in most circumstances, subject to particular scrutiny. Aino Nikop-Koski worked in Finnish healthcare for 5 years as a nurse. During that period, she killed 5 patients and attempted to kill 5 more. Aino Nikop-Koski was born in November 1950 in Finland. The details of her early life are not fully documented in accessible sources. She trained as a nurse and worked across a range of healthcare settings between 2004 and 2009. Hospitals, residential care homes, and the homes of patients requiring private nursing visits. The variety of her workplaces was operationally significant. A cluster of suspicious deaths at a single institution would eventually raise concerns. Deaths distributed across multiple settings over a period of years in a profession where patient mortality is expected and normal were much harder to identify as a pattern. Between 2004 and 2009, Nikop-Koski killed 5 elderly patients using sedatives and opiates, medications that were available to her through legitimate healthcare channels, and that, administered in excess, suppress respiration and cause death. She attempted to kill 5 others. She also committed 3 aggravated assaults, 4 thefts, and 2 drug possession offenses during the same period. Investigators and prosecutors were ultimately unable to establish a clear motive for the murders. She did not kill for financial gain. She did not kill, as far as the record shows, in response to any personal conflict with her victims. She did not articulate a philosophy about the value of life or the ethics of end-of-life care. She killed people who were ill and dependent on her in settings designed for their care, using the tools her profession had given her access to. No coherent explanation has ever been produced for why. Nikop-Koski was arrested in March 2009. Her trial was held at Helsinki District Court in December 2010. She pleaded not guilty to all charges. The court convicted her on 5 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, and the additional charges related to assault, theft, and drug possession. A psychiatric evaluation conducted as part of proceedings found that she exhibited psychopathic traits and antisocial personality disorder, but concluded that she was fully culpable. The disorder characterized a pattern of behavior without constituting a legal defense. She was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 12 years before eligibility for likely pardon. The Helsinki Court of Appeals upheld the conviction in March 2012. The Supreme Court of Finland dismissed her application for leave to appeal in November 2012. The case was closed. Following conviction, she changed her legal name to Ann-Maria Milgren. The case generated significant public and professional discussion in Finland. A female serial killer operating in a healthcare context was unusual in the country's criminal history. The questions the case raised about institutional oversight, about how a pattern of deaths could occur across multiple settings over 5 years without earlier detection, were not easily answered and are not fully answered now. The Finnish healthcare system that employed Nikop-Koski across those years was not, by any available account, negligent in an obvious sense. She moved between workplaces. She was trained and apparently competent. The deaths she caused were individually consistent with the expected mortality profile of elderly, unwell patients. It was only in aggregate and only in retrospect that the pattern became visible. Aino Nikop-Koski is currently in her mid-70s and imprisoned in Finland. The 5 patients she killed had each survived to old age, had reached a point where they needed medical care, and had entered a system that they had reason to trust. That system had placed a psychopathic nurse in rooms with them, equipped with medications that could end their lives, in conditions where nobody was watching closely enough. They died in beds designed for their recovery. The reason they died there, the specific internal logic, if there was one, that motivated Nikop-Koski to kill them, remains, as the court record confirms, unknown. Case number 9, Roger Carlson, 3 days. Roger Carlson grew up in what every available account describes as a stable, middle-class environment in Falun, Sweden. He performed well in school. He was described by people who had known him as calm, kind, and reliable, an assessment that appears in accounts of his background, and that is not unusual in cases involving sudden catastrophic violence connected to severe psychiatric breakdown. The absence of warning in such cases is frequently part of the clinical picture, rather than evidence against it. The records do not suggest that anyone who knew Carlson before January 2001 had reason to fear what he was about to do. What happened at the end of January happened very quickly. Over the course of 3 days, 3 people died. And then the man who had killed them walked to a police station and surrendered. Lars Roger Carlson was born on June 24, 1968, in Falun, and was living in Gothenburg, a city of approximately 500,000 people on Sweden's west coast, by the time he was in his early 30s. He had 2 former romantic partners living in the city and a professional acquaintance. He had been using alcohol and amphetamines heavily in the period leading up to the killings, a detail that investigators and the subsequent psychiatric evaluation identified as a significant contributing factor to what followed, though not in the legal analysis as a mitigating one that altered his culpability. On January 29, 2001, he went to the Albatross Golf Club and killed his former girlfriend, Maria Dominguez. He strangled her and struck her with blunt force. On January 31st, he went to the Gothenburg apartment of his other former partner, Cecilia Berglund, and killed her with an axe. On February 1st, he walked into a central street in Gothenburg in broad daylight and killed restaurateur Lars Hansen, also with an axe, in view of other people on the street. He then went to a police station. He said he had done it. He confessed to all 3 murders. He said he retained only fragmented memory of the events, and that he could not clearly explain, particularly in relation to the 2 women, what had motivated the killings. The forensic psychiatric examination that followed the arrest found that Carlson had been in the grip of a severe psychotic disorder at the time of the crimes. The heavy substance use appeared to have precipitated or significantly worsened that disorder. The Gothenburg District Court heard the case in June 2001, found him guilty of all 3 counts of murder, and, on the basis of the psychiatric finding, sentenced him not to imprisonment, but to compulsory forensic psychiatric care, with mandatory periodic review of whether continued detention remained necessary. This outcome, and the legal framework it reflects, became one of the most discussed aspects of the case. 3 people had been killed. The man who killed them would not enter the general prison population. He would receive treatment in a secure psychiatric facility. Swedish law draws a careful line between culpability and punishment in cases of this kind, holding that a person who commits violence as a direct consequence of severe and documented mental illness presents a clinical problem alongside the legal one, and that compulsory psychiatric treatment in a secure setting addresses both the individual's condition and the public safety interest more effectively than a conventional prison term. This principle has a coherent internal logic. It does not, for the families of the dead necessarily feel like justice in a form they can recognize. What followed, in clinical terms, was relatively straightforward. Carlson responded to treatment within the secure psychiatric setting. Within approximately a year and a half, psychiatric assessments concluded that his condition had stabilized significantly. He was gradually granted supervised leave, first for study, then for work experience, then for brief periods outside the facility. By 2003 and 2004, he was living with considerable freedom while remaining formally under psychiatric supervision. He was eventually discharged from compulsory care. He has not reoffended in the years since. Maria Dominguez, Cecilia Berglund, and Lars Hansen were three people living ordinary lives in Gothenburg at the beginning of 2001. Two of them had been in relationships with the man who killed them. One had a professional connection to him. None of them had done anything that could have predicted what was coming, because there was nothing to predict. The violence emerged from a mental state that no one, including Carlson himself, had identified or anticipated. The absence of motive, particularly for the two women, is the element of the case that most resists resolution. Carlson said he could not explain it. The psychiatric record does not contradict him. He had been in the grip of something that collapsed the architecture that governs ordinary behavior. What emerged from that collapse, over 3 days in Gothenburg, in January and February 2001, was 3 deaths, a legal debate about how to respond to violence when its origin is psychiatric, and a question about what justice means in those circumstances that Sweden has not finished answering. Case number 10, Esa Åkerlund, released. The question that runs underneath the case of Esa Åkerlund is one that every justice system is eventually forced to confront, and that no justice system has found a consistently satisfactory way to answer. It is the question of what happens when someone who has been convicted of killing is released back into society and kills again. It is a question that arrives weighted with hindsight, because the second killing is, by definition, something the system had the theoretical capacity to prevent. The first time Esa Åkerlund killed, he was sent to prison. The second, third, and fourth victims died in a restaurant in a suburb of Helsinki on a Tuesday afternoon in 2010, at the hands of a man who had served his sentence, been assessed as eligible for release, and returned to civilian life. The system had functioned as designed. It had not been enough. Esa Kalla Vitori Åkerlund was born on July 5th, 1969, in Porvoo, Finland. In 1995, he was convicted of the murder of his ex-wife. The court imposed a sentence of life imprisonment. He served that sentence and was eventually paroled, completing his release conditions and returning to the community in the greater Helsinki area. In June 2010, a dispute developed between Åkerlund and a group of men with connections to a restaurant in Espoo. The specific origins and nature of that dispute are documented in Finnish-language court records, not fully accessible in English. What is documented in available sources is the outcome. On July 6, 2010, Åkerlund entered the restaurant armed with a 9mm revolver that had been purchased illegally in May 2010 from 2 acquaintances. He opened fire. 3 men were killed. 2 more were wounded. The surveillance footage that recorded the shootings was ordered sealed for 25 years by the court at the request of the victims' families, who did not want it circulated publicly. Åkerlund was arrested the same day. The investigation that followed examined not only the killings, but the circumstances that had made them possible. How had a man convicted of murder and released on parole from a life sentence legally obtained access to a firearm? The answer was that he had not done so legally. The revolver had been sold to him illegally by 2 men who were subsequently charged and convicted for their role in the transaction. The illegal mechanism did not, however, resolve the deeper question. A man with a murder conviction had been released, had reintegrated into society for a period, and had then killed 3 more people. The 2 men who sold him the gun had provided the specific instrument. The system that assessed him as suitable for release had provided the conditions. His trial on the 3 2010 murders was conducted in October 2010. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. The sentence was upheld on appeal. International news coverage, particularly in the United States, generated criticism of Finnish sentencing practice. The response that 15 years for triple murder, imposed on a man already convicted of a prior killing, seemed inadequate by international standards was widely expressed. In Finland, sentences are calibrated within a framework that emphasizes rehabilitation and de-emphasizes punitive length relative to many comparable democracies. Whether that framework is well served by outcomes of this kind, a prior murderer released, rearmed, and responsible for 3 further deaths, is a debate the Finnish legal system has not publicly resolved in the specific context of this case. Åkerlund is currently in his mid-50s and remains imprisoned. He has now served, across both convictions and the periods between them, a significant portion of his adult life in the Finnish prison system. The 3 men killed in the 2010 restaurant shooting have been largely absent from the English language account of the case, which has focused primarily on the systemic and sentencing questions, rather than on who they were individually. This is a familiar pattern in cases that become arguments about policy. The argument absorbs the deaths. The people who were killed become data points in a debate about whether the system failed. It did fail. That is the clearest thing that can be said. A man convicted of murder was released, encountered a conflict, acquired a weapon, and killed 3 more people. The system had made a determination that he was no longer dangerous. That determination was wrong. Whether a different determination would have resulted in a different outcome, whether keeping Åkerlund imprisoned indefinitely would have meant those 3 men in Espoo were still alive, depends on choices that were not made, and on a future that did not happen and cannot now be reconstructed. What can be reconstructed is what did happen. The sentence, the release, the weapon purchased in May, and the 3 men who died in July.